I'm I'm Duncan Bowie. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Socialist History Society. We're very pleased to have with us this evening James Crossley, who's a professor at Cambridge University, amongst other things, and is speaking on his new book on A.L. Morton and the radical tradition. Some of you may have listened to a session we had a few months ago on Leslie Morton. It was obviously a favourite of the time. Very much involved in the Communist Party history group. And of course, the Socialist History Society is a successor body, or the successor body of that organization. So it's very much part of our society's tradition. So it's good to see another very full work on Leslie Morton. James is going to speak for about 50 minutes or so. He's got a presentation and there will then be time for questions. If you can all mute yourselves while James is speaking, save your questions for the end. Please don't fill up question Q&A. Otherwise, that's a bit distracting for the speaker. But obviously, after James has finished, I will take you in order I see you, either on screen or for putting your hand up under the Q&A session. So over to James. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share the screen first, so just bear with me one moment. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Great. Okay, well, there is much I could say about Arthur Leslie Morton, but I'll have to stick to something of an overview here, picking out what I hope are significant examples of his work, though I will inevitably leave things out, as I'm sure many of you will notice. Fortunately, Ariel Hessian spoke about Morton last year and gave plenty of detail on Morton's genial, if shy, personality and analysis of his work on the 17th century in particular. So I'll try not to repeat too much there, but some overlap is inevitable. Oh, come on. Try this. There we go. Morton was born in 1903 at Stanshill's farm near Bury St Edmunds. He associated the countryside with his father, Arthur Spence Morton. Arthur was born in Richmond, Yorkshire, and was brought up on the family farm. While Leslie left behind the manual farming work, he would later return from London to the family farm and the countryside to complete A People's History of England, and he always had a keen interest in the history of rural England throughout his writings and his vision of an England transformed. It was said that Morton was in his element if we had 3 or 4 farm workers or rural workers in a little cottage somewhere in an isolated village, explaining to them about the enclosures or Kett's Rebellion. Morton would later dedicate some space in A People's History of England to cover the development of 19th century farming in relation to the Industrial Revolution. Understanding these worlds may have been necessary for his retelling of the national story, but they also reflected personal interests, as Morton's immediate family background was a combination of farmers and the urban middle classes. Leslie's mother, Mary Hannah Lamprey, hailed from Kentish Town, where Leslie himself would live briefly, and was the daughter of Thomas Lamprey, a paper merchant and newspaper proprietor from a nonconformist background and a draper household, and Annie Hutchinson, who came from a solicitor household. Annie was also born in Yorkshire, Kirkby Ravensworth, and therefore provided another Richmondshire family connection for Morton. So while Suffolk received most regional attention from Morton in his publications, there was some interest in Yorkshire and his countryside, and in a number of publications, perhaps most famously on the Bronte sisters. His most niche interest was a family relative, George Henry Harrison of Washton, aka James Philippe, who also went by more extravagant names such as Marshal General Plantagenet Harrison. While claiming to be the legitimate heir of Henry VI and possibly the nation's rightful monarch instead of Victoria, Plantagenet Harrison was also a Yorkshireman and the author of the History of Yorkshire. For a young Morton, being taken by an uncle to the Guildhall Library to be shown the history of Yorkshire was a great day in my life, he said. This Victorian character clearly had a long-lasting impact on the adult Morton, who continued to collect details on Plantagenet Harrison. It was a telling interest because the shy, austere, disciplined party man, Morton, was regularly attracted to eccentrics and dreamers, both personally and in his historical work. After being tutored at home, he attended King Edward VI Grammar School in Bury St Edmunds, which had a typical royalist, Anglican and imperial ambience, including an officer training corps. When he was 15, Morton was sent to Eastbourne College. The First World War intensified the militaristic and imperialist interests of the college, and an interest in the role of warfare in English history became a recurring feature of Morton's scholarship. But there were also less orthodox influences on Morton. In addition to being nearly obsessed with Shakespeare, he knew by heart a translation of Persian astrological poetry by the King Edward alumnus Edward Fitzgerald. But Morton was also reacting against his schooling as his politics were moving leftward, thanks to the Russian Revolution, World War I, and horror at the potential for technology to destroy the countryside. Among the many authors he was reading, Jack London was the one he viewed as life-changing. Soon after, he moved on to William Morris, followed by Marx and Lenin. Morton studied history and English at Cambridge between 1921 and 1924. His political ideas developed as he became involved in what would become influential socialist circles led by Maurice Dobb. While Morton was at Cambridge, T.S. Eliot published The Wasteland, an account of civilizational collapse that influenced Morton's socialism, despite Eliot moving in the opposite political direction. Morton increasingly saw the revolutionary transformation associated with the Soviet Union as the answer to the crisis of capitalism he saw outlined by Eliot. Morton stayed in contact with Eliot, and Morton's own poetry was very much in the vein of Eliot. Another unlikely influence was the Cambridge professor of Latin and poet A.E. Housman. Morton saw in Housman's popular poetry an appreciation of the countryside that could be used for the revolutionary cause. Housman was popular because people were increasingly sick of the values of capitalism, he argued, while the courageous and dignified characteristics of Housman's rural types were the very characteristics required of the revolutionary. Housman's vision of the countryside was an important influence on Morton because it helped him conceptualize what England could be, with technological advances quietly aiding this development in the background. Now, I think it's a misunderstanding to claim that Morton had reactionary tendencies when he wrote on Housman, the Brontes, Swift, or the English countryside. Morton remained a dedicated dialectical materialist. Traditional conservatism for Morton can be useful for criticizing the ravages of capitalism and even pointing to some socialist ideals, which could be taken up in socialist and working class circles. But Morton always stressed that fidelity to conservatism means remaining mired in a nostalgia that fails to offer a vision for the transformation of the future. Anyway, after Cambridge, Morton took up a teaching post in 1924 at the grammar school in the conservative market town of Stenning. Despite disliking his time there, he befriended the eccentric poet, publisher, and bohemian's bohemian Victor Neuberg, a former close follower of the occultist Aleister Crowley. Whilst Morton was not, obviously, a believer in the world of magic, he discussed such issues with Neuberg and developed a Marxist reading of the history of magic, witchcraft, and the evolution of religion in minor publications in the 1920s and 1930s. The pair also discussed English radical history, and from the Marx Memorial Library archives, I think we can now establish that it was through Neuberg that Morton developed his interest in William Blake. After supporting the general strike of 1926, Morton was made redundant. He moved closer to home and soon began to work for A.S. Neill's progressive Summerhill School in Leiston. Here, Morton met his first wife, Bronwyn Jones, and after marrying in 1928, they moved to London as members of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Morton was in and out of work as the couple had to look after their child, and a child Bronwyn had previously. Their marriage was not a happy one, and Bronwyn fell out with Harry Pollitt, which made life problematic for all parties. In these difficult years, Morton began to be monitored by the secret services. They outline his marital difficulties, withdrawnness, shabby dress sense, and significant weight loss for an already slim man. And this is all corroborated by Bronwyn's concerned letters to Morton. He was followed, spies watching him in council debates in the public gallery. They observed his reading habits at the British Museum, with reading literature bearing on an extremist point of view. He gave a talk at Islington where he was described as being something of an idealist who at times bordered on religious revivalism. By 1934, the couple had split, though they remained close friends for the rest of her life. Morton turned his life around. Never the snappiest dresser, he was nevertheless now much smarter. The weight returned, and he took on steady employment at the Daily Worker. There's a couple of pictures from 1924 and 1939 from the National Archive, from these Secret Service file. Morton quickly settled down with Vivian Jackson, the daughter of the working class autodidact and communist intellectual T.A. Jackson, Tommy Jackson. Their marriage was much happier, and in another life I'd happily give a paper on Vivian's letters because they're fantastic. Anyway, in early 1930s London, in the era of class against class, the relationship between the Communist Party and other liberal and left groups was obviously hostile. In this setting, Morton recalled how difficult it was for intellectuals to thrive in what was then, he called, a very proletarian party, and so Morton had to keep a low profile until accepted. Morton was engaged in menial work for the Communist Party in more deprived areas of London. Nevertheless, Morton saw this as essential training for party intellectuals that should be expected, and something he believed the left lost as the century went on, and intellectuals were more associated with universities or removed from working class interests. Morton also published reviews and articles on history, literature and politics in the Daily Worker and literary journals such as The Criterion, run by Eliot, and Scrutiny. In these articles, he developed Marxist understandings of English and European history, the transformation from capitalism to socialism, human relations in a post-revolutionary society, and an anthropology of religion, all culminating in 1938, when Morton published his most famous book, and probably the first sustained Marxist history of the nation, A People's History of England. The People's History of England provides an account of the transformation from ancient forms of society through the rise and fall of feudalism and onto capitalism, the rise of the working class, and the potential inbreaking of a new era of socialism. For Morton, these transformations in England were the product of, for instance, competing class interests and technological advances. This framework meant the book stood in stark contrast to the standard histories of the nation framed around monarchs, leading politicians, and great individuals. As Naomi Mitchison put it in her review, it must have been great fun for the author to write about all those chapters on the last century without once mentioning Queen Victoria or Prince Albert. The English Revolution played a crucial role in this history, including the radical sects and movements, some of which at this point he dismissed as infantile and ultra-leftist, making strategically naive demands too ahead of their time to be realised. Morton stressed the historical significance of the popular forces unleashed in the English Revolution and saw Cromwell, for all his failures and flaws, as someone able to harness their potential for progressive purposes. Morton's criticisms of naive utopianism and his praise for popular coalitions in A People's History of England should be understood in the context of the late 1930s and the rise of fascism. The popular front line of the Communist Party at the time involved the promotion of broad alliances, even with non-socialists, to defeat the fascist threat to democracy and enable the developments towards socialism. Communists were encouraged to connect national progressive and revolutionary movements of the past with struggles of the present. These connections between past and present run throughout A People's History of England, as Morton saw longer-term historical significance in and connections between rebellious peasants and priests, heretical religious movements, 17th century militancy, Jacobins, Chartists, trade unionists, suffragism, and the emergence of the working class, alongside occasional implicit warnings from history about fascism. I'll just give one brief example. What Morton called the Peasants' Rising of 1381 carried a threat to the ruling class and a challenge to reactionary forces because it was a well-organised, pragmatic, unified, non-sectarian and largely disciplined protest. The Rising may have had a background in primitive communism, always a capital C here when he's discussing it, and featured prominent preachers of communism, such as the apocalyptic priest John Ball, but such communism was significantly downplayed in the demands made by the peasants. Instead, Morton argued, the rebels focused on probably a minimum upon which all were agreed in order to provide a powerful, united front. The People's History propelled Morton to some prominence as a leftist intellectual. Distribution of the book through the Left Book Club networks were important in establishing his and its reputation. To give some sense of scale, by mid-1938 there were around 50,000 subscribing LBC members, while between May and October 1938 there was a rise in LBC groups from 800 to 1,006. Of course, how many actually read the book is moot. At a Left Book Club meeting in Tunbridge Wells, an unsentimental but sympathetic R.W. Patterson warned that the working man had no time to make the comprehensive study of history, and that although the Left Book Club had 50,000 members, he doubted if it had more than 1,000 people. He didn't think any more would read A People's History of England. Nevertheless, the book was widely discussed in Left Book Club groups, and one of the recurring features of the discussions was that participants repeatedly engaged with ideas of historical materialism. This is in sharp contrast with the press reviews, which, while generally positive, offered minimal awareness of this type of Marxist thinking. Morton's Secret Service files also show that the book was assessed to see if it was unsuitable for school teachers. Although it was deemed to be tendentious and annoying, no action was deemed justifiable. Before the start of the Second World War, Morton had moved back to Leiston. He enjoyed the Eel's Foot pub nearby, frequented by farm workers and fishermen, where he developed his interest in lingering folk traditions that had just about survived capitalism and their combination of bawdiness and utopian impulses. Morton and the folklorist A.L. Lloyd even managed to secure a budget from the BBC to get drinking and singing flowing so they could record the evening's events in May 1939. Some of the recordings are available, some you can actually buy, but I annoyingly wasn't able to find one of Morton's singing, or at least as far as I know. This is probably because Morton likely sang McCafferty on the night, which BBC officials deemed mutinous and was struck from the broadcasting during the war. The song is, after all, about a soldier shooting his officers. At Leiston, Morton was part of a small but thriving communist culture centred around the local newspaper, the Leiston Leader. Morton and others used the Leiston Leader to push the Communist Party line on the war. This meant an initial enthusiasm to fight fascism, followed by explaining the changing communist position following the non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany in August 1939. The ire of the Leiston Leader was turned against the British ruling class led by Chamberlain, and fascist aggression kept in check by Soviet diplomacy and power, they argued. The emphasis changed, of course, following the German attack on the Soviet Union, and the Leiston Leader went full-on propaganda for the war effort, both British and Soviet. Morton's treatment of one target got him into trouble. He challenged the censorship at home under the, and I quote, stupid blimp Sir James Grigg, then Secretary of State for War. Morton also referred to him as a danger and, evoking appeasement, implied Grigg and his Munich pals preferred fighting the Russians. There was also substance to Morton's argument behind the polemic. Grigg had refused to allow the Daily Worker the right to appoint a war correspondent, removed an expert on the Red Army from the list of army lectures, and banned a pre-arranged BBC programme featuring a tribute from the British Army to the Red Army. Morton was hauled before a sizable sergeant major. While there was some reluctance to act against Morton, he was nonetheless taken off to court-martial. Morton was cleared after a close legal analysis of the King's regulations, whereby his innocence was proven on the grounds that the Minister for War was a civilian, about whom army personnel were within their rights to make such remarks. The offending article did not indicate that Morton was a soldier, so there was no case of a lack of military discipline. During the war, Morton combined organising for the Communist Party with army service, which was mostly labouring on the Isle of Sheppey. Towards the end of the war, he sought a transfer to the Education Corps. At the interview with the section board, he found out that the court-martial recommendation was still in his files, which angered the commanding officer because Morton was found innocent. Yet despite being recommended for the Education Corps, Morton did not get the transfer. While he inevitably wrote less during the war, Morton developed ideas about utopianism and started re-evaluating his views on the value of future transformation in religious thinking. Some of these ideas are included in his short collection of essays, The Language of Men, from 1945. After the war, Morton had a short stint as a local councillor, something he'd been interested in since 1930. On the Urban District Council, Morton and communist representatives instigated monthly meetings with the townspeople and foregrounded the issue of housing, alongside interest on loan charges, the reinstatement of the recreation ground, and local industrial developments. This time, he claimed, was one of the most exciting and useful times in my life. Morton was, of course, a key figure in the development of the famed Communist Party Historians Group. One of the reasons the group was founded was to revise a people's history of England, and a new edition was published in 1948. Christopher Hill's suggestions were largely ones of nuance, wording, and minor factual corrections, some of which Morton accepted, even word for word, some of which he didn't. Edward Miller provided more expansive criticisms. For example, Miller was critical of Morton's stress on the 13th century, marking the political and economic decline of feudalism, and so Morton rewrote the opening paragraphs, now placing the stress on the transformation over the long term. The heyday of the Historians Group, 1946 to 1956, drew the interest of the Secret Services. There were moles in the Historians Group, including someone reporting back on Morton's activities, and his letters were intercepted. According to one report, there was a well-placed, and wait for it, unconscious subsource in the Historians Group. And if anyone wants to ask me who this was, I don't know, because no one is named. For the Communist Party Historians Group, 1946 to 1956 was marked by an intense concern for understanding national history in relation to the transformation of society from feudalism to capitalism and the rise of socialism, as well as the development of history from below and the idea of an English radical tradition. Morton led the way, particularly in his study of 17th century religious sects, the growth of the labour movement and its precursors in pre-modern radicalism, and the history of utopianism. Morton's post-war presentation of this sort of history marked a shift in emphasis. He was now moving away from criticisms of utopianism, millenarian dreamers and lost causes as naive, to stressing how their progressive potential fed into the long-term development of democracy and socialism. For instance, in 1949, for the 300th anniversary of the regicide, Morton published on the significance of the levellers and radical movements in the longer term. Where they failed, he argued, they also showed the future. The working class, war veterans, and communists could now succeed in transforming society and challenging colonialism. Influenced by his friend Iris Morley, Morton also turned to what he saw as the lingering radicalism in the build-up to 1688 and the so-called Glorious Revolution, particularly in the Monmouth Rebellion and the Battle of Sedgemoor. In 1954, Morton and the Historians Group met at Netherwood Guest House near Hastings, where Morton gave a paper on the role of the common people in the history of British capitalism. This was turned into an obscure article, but was among his most influential, particularly his claim that we need to understand the aspirations of thousands of obscure men and women. It's clear from minutes, letters, and other sources that this paper generated a lot of excitement and was very well received by the historians. Hobsbawm later reflected that Morton's article made him a major forerunner for the study of history from below, which would later take off in the universities. And it seems that the historians group knew at the time that this paper marked something of a shift. Around this time, Morton was arguing that the agitation associated with Sedgemoor represented or included in its ranks the last defenders of the utopia of all jolly fellows, of the proud independent man, neither exploiting nor exploited, eating and drinking of his own abundance. Despite its failure, the rebellion included a plebeian element who also played their role in the revolutionary transformation of England towards a bourgeois state, and sowed the seeds for future socialist transformation. At another meeting in 1953, Morton agreed to write on the history of the British labour movement. The resulting book was written by Morton and George Tate, of course, published in 1956 under the title The British Labour Movement, 1770 to 1920. Morton was responsible for the first 3 chapters covering the period up to the late 19th century. He looked to the rise of capitalism and the working class alongside, for instance, trade, colonisation, technological developments, the Industrial Revolution, political reform, class consciousness, Jacobinism, Peterloo, Sparfields, Cato Street, utopian socialism, Chartism, trade unionism and socialism. At this time, Morton, along with Christopher Hill, also agreed to help Donna Torr complete her biography of Tom Mann. Morton was overworked as he took on the role of convener of the 16th and 17th century section of the historians group, and he had promised an article on Joseph Arch, which he had forgotten about. As he put it in one letter, "Meanwhile, I have just had the vast mass of Donna Torr stuff on which I rashly promised to work. God help me." But complete it he did, whether through divine assistance or not, just as he would soon publish on Arch. The chapters by Morton form an interlude to Mann's biographical story by providing a history of the centuries of struggle leading up to the emergence of socialism. Both the chapters for Torr and for the British labour movement are dominated by a narrative of hope, positives, and what can be celebrated in historic failures, in contrast to the popular frontist critique of failure in a people's history of England. Morton had much to say on Chartism and its aftermath, some of which would have been familiar to readers of a people's history. In the 1950s, though, Morton was again concerned for the legacy of failures of the movement. These chapters are now much more forgiving of failures in Chartism and appreciative of how seemingly lost causes played their part in keeping ideas alive against the odds. He was now especially concerned with Ernest Jones. In A People's History of England, Jones received meagre attention and was criticised for misjudging the circumstances and level of support for an insurrection during the decline of Chartism. Influenced by discussions with John Savile, Morton now saw Jones and his efforts to keep Chartism alive a century earlier as heroic. Jones was now understood as both appreciating the need for organisation and seeing Chartism as a class force which was unique among Chartist leaders. Without Jones, it was very doubtful if the First International would have been possible in 1864. Jones kept the principles of democracy and internationalism at the fore when they were in danger of being lost to sight, and his battle against the stream helped prepare the way for revolutionary socialism. As ever, Morton's history had one eye on the present. Some claims were blunt, such as the claim that more clear-sighted Chartists would have no difficulty in accepting the declaration of the British Road to Socialism, the programme of the Communist Party. More generally, though, this shift in emphasis about his heroic failure is most striking. This reclamation of an English radical tradition and the promotion of centuries-long hopes for a better England were an attempt by Morton and the historians group to compensate for the disillusionment of the political situation in post-war England, which seemed to be heading in a different direction. The Labour government was not pushing for socialism and was supporting American imperialism, while the nation seemed to be taking a conservative turn by the 1950s. The historians group were overcompensating, if you prefer. Morton's major publication in this era was The English Utopia, 1952. The English Utopia is emphatically forward-looking in its account of the English past. The book is grounded in the story of cocaine, the medieval utopian land of plenty. Morton then traced the changing history of utopian dreams in English cultural history, particularly focusing on utopian literature, from what he saw as the idealistic concept of utopia in relation to medieval peasant hopes, the rise of bourgeois thought, particularly its progressive aspirations, and the emergence of socialism. William Morris's News from Nowhere was the final synthesis of the developments of the English utopia, because Morris knew that the realization of dreams about peace, leisure, and abundance required more than peasant desires or bourgeois reasoning. It required class struggle. For Morton, the Soviet Union had since rendered literary utopias obsolete because the transformation to a better world was now beginning to happen, he argued. The English utopia also contained sustained polemics against H.G. Wells, Fabians, and the modern Labour Party, culminating in a full-on attack on George Orwell, a writer of counter-revolutionary apologetics who represented the sorry degeneration of a once optimistic bourgeois utopian thought into what Morton called anti-utopia. The English utopia also contains warnings about a new kind of fascism that is threatening to arise out of American imperialism. Fascism was no mysterious disease for Morton, but something arising naturally in certain conditions from declining capitalism, he argued. And now behind American imperialism was a new power, the bomb. American imperialism was not a prominent topic in Morton's publications thus far, but was about to be, as the Communist Party turned to combating American cultural imperialism at the turn of the 1950s. Morton himself published Get Out in 1953, the most polemical work he ever wrote. Morton argued that the violent American comics and films were part of the same imperialist agenda as the presence of American bases and military personnel in Britain. And there's plenty more to say on that, including fights on the street, but no time, I'm afraid. In 1950, the Mortons had moved to the old chapel in Clare, Suffolk, where they lived for the rest of their days. While rural life, writing, tennis, gardening, and local party organising suited Morton, he was also involved in international developments and became a regular traveller to Eastern Europe. Morton was one of 4 delegates from the Communist Party Historians Group, along with Hobsbawm, Hill, and Robert Browning. You may be familiar with these pictures. Invited to the Soviet Union over Christmas and New Year 1954-1955 by the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Morton was reported to have spoken on popular uprisings prior to the 18th century and the role of martyrs in Britain's history. Morton also reported on English views about European security. The report from the British Embassy in Moscow explained that Morton was completely won over by Soviet propaganda and had criticised, among other things, American bases in England and the policy of rearming Germany, NATO, and bourgeois historians, while he delivered an anecdote about the popularity of Soviet footballers in England. The denunciation of Stalin by Khrushchev in 1956 changed everything, of course. Along with the Soviet military intervention in Hungary and debates over inner-party democracy, the fallout from Khrushchev's speech contributed to a sharp loss in members of the Communist Party of Great Britain, including members of the Historians Group, Hill, the Thompsons, Hilton, and so on. Morton made a special plea for the case of Thompson and John Savile to be reinstated. He wrote to James Klugman on the executive committee about the bad business involving Thompson and Savile, actions by which we can by no means approve. He accepted that, in a sense, this was no business of his and that he did not have all the facts, but that he felt he should make his opinion known, namely, that while I'm in the favour of the widest and freest discussions, I don't think that the methods they have adopted are the correct ones. Yet, he also offered a defence of his friends as valuable and honest people, first-rate comrades, and argued that every effort ought to be made at retaining them in the party, even if it meant stretching points in a way that till recently we would have thought inconceivable, he argued. Morton did not believe that the party could afford to drive away such people and was concerned that expulsion, justifiable though it may be, would be widely misunderstood. and would have an adverse effect on comrades struggling to adjust to the situation and would be taken up as instances of victimization. And I think Morton must have had examples like the dissenting Christopher Hill in mind when he said such expulsions would be interpreted by some comrades as a step against free discussion. Morton, however, stayed, and I don't think that was ever in doubt. He remained close friends with those historians who left and used and discussed their work. But he was also critical of the emerging New Left, if usually implicitly. He supported the idea that university-based intellectuals and professional people could be lured in by the perks of bourgeois society while simultaneously criticising bourgeois society. He continued to argue that socialist intellectuals needed to be closely aligned to the labour movement and working class interests and not given preferential treatment. In a range of publications from this period, whether on Joseph Arch, Chartists, Utopianism, or aesthetics, he argued that that weaknesses arise when too much influence is conceded to middle-class thinkers, intellectuals, and their networks. On his own terms, and I stress that, Morton was right. In the long run, the liberal-leaning intellectuals around Marxism today, in the 1970s and 1980s, and associated with the media and universities, did play no small part in the demise of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And whatever we make of Morton's argument, I think it also helps explain Morton's position after 1956. We can see his socialisation, where the countervailing influence of the party was far stronger than that of the universities and bourgeois society and its intelligentsia. Morton remained, as he always was, a disciplined party man. He was part of a delegation sent to the Soviet Union to assess the state of socialism there post-Stalin. He regularly found himself having to explain the position of the Communist Party. An Eastern Counties meeting of the Communist Party following Khrushchev was described as the most traumatic in memory. Morton apparently calmed the situation. He explained the whole history of the Soviet Union from its birth, the reaction of the world, and the fear of the world to the birth of this new idea was emerging in the Soviet Union. It was part of any progressive historical development for major catastrophes to take place. And the Soviet Union still yet had to wipe out the lingering mentalities inherited from capitalism. Morton's commemoration of Cromwell in 1958 suggests something of his thinking on the matter. He stressed that people look to figures like Cromwell as individuals rather than to a highly complex set of tendencies and class struggles, and how revolutionary change can throw up a bewildering range of contradictions. But that he can also make progressive advancements, whatever the moral failings of the individuals involved. And if you look at the language of Cromwell, used of Cromwell, you can quite easily see for Cromwell, read Stalin. Even so, there is a telling decline in Morton's references to the Soviet Union from the late 1950s onwards. After the crises of 1956-1957, Morton continued as the flag bearer for Communist Party historians, despite their now weakened position in the face of the emergent New Left. Morton synthesized his work and the work of others to offer a general theory of millenarianism and historical development. Medieval peasant uprisings, he argued, had an element of hysteria, but only in the sense that they categorized victory in the realm of fantasy. The fantastical understanding of victory was necessary because the material conditions for victory in the medieval world did not yet exist. These dreams were transformed with and by changing historical circumstances, such as the rise of capitalism and an organized working class. Morton's most notable contribution in this era was, I think, The Everlasting Gospel, a study in the sources of William Blake. Anticipating E.P. Thompson's famous study, Morton saw Blake's fantastical mythology, apocalyptic language, and the use of the Book of Revelation as integral to his political radicalism, antinomian instincts, and understanding of the industrializing New World. Morton argued that Blake was an innovative utopian thinker, such as Blake's understanding that the New Jerusalem is to be built, a proactive move which stood in contrast to the utopia typical of utopian literature, the island waiting to be discovered. But Morton also argued that Blake had his limitations because he was active before the advent of an organised working class and the development of socialist thinking, and was thus left bewildered. Morton was also interested in influences on Blake, notably from historic religious sects. Blake inherited and adapted this language, Morton argued, but it was language becoming obsolete in 19th century resistance to capitalism. Morton thus claimed Blake was the greatest English antinomian, but also the last. Morton's explanation of how historic and influential millenarian and utopian thinking was rendered obsolete or transformed with the rise of capitalism was taken up by the most influential Marxist arguments concerning apocalypticism, those of Eric Hobsbawm. By the end of the 1950s, we see a critical moment in British scholarship on millenarianism, and it's tied up with Cold War anxieties. Whereas Morton and Hobsbawm offered a Marxist understanding of millenarianism, Norman Cohen published the first edition of his influential book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, in 1957. Cohen argued that the militant millenarianism of medieval Europe connected with modern totalitarian movements, among which the structure of the basic fantasies seems to have changed scarcely at all. And for Cohen, the main totalitarian heirs were communists and Nazis. The political ramifications of Cohen's work were not lost on Morton and his colleagues. Christopher Hill wrote to Morton asking whether he had seen The Pursuit of the Millennium, calling it a black, reactionary book, but full of fascinating material. Morton himself made essentially the same point, praising the collection of data while criticising the ahistorical anti-communism of Cohen. While emphases have changed, the legacy of the split between liberal and Marxist assessments of millenarianism continues to resonate in scholarship today. Morton and the British Marxist historians represent a significant moment in the development of an influential trajectory of millenarianism understood in emancipatory terms, though the historical materialism is typically watered down or excluded today. At least as equally influential, Cohen represents an alternative liberal reading and hostility towards millenarian excess and its alleged illiberal legacy, which has become embedded in parts of academia and mainstream politics and media. In the 1960s, Morton continued to reassess the significance of utopianism and lost causes in his work on Chartism, Robert Owen, and the history of British socialism and literature. While primarily a collection of essays of Marxist literary criticism, The Matter of Britain from 1966 should be seen as the cultural equivalent of A People's History of England. The collection starts with the decline of feudalism, which is told through an analysis of the legends of King Arthur, moves through Shakespeare and the rise of bourgeois thought, and ends with an appreciation of T.S. Eliot in the context of decaying capitalism. In The Matter of Britain, Morton also collected essays on the contradictions in conservative literature and thought. He illustrated the contradictions at play in conservative-inspired outrage at bourgeois exploitation and how such thinking and literature could not offer a serious solution. Nevertheless, writers sympathetic to both conservatism and early forms of socialism paved the way for audiences to move on to scientific socialism, he argued. Morton also represented a significant tendency in discussions of culture in the post-war Communist Party. Morton and others of his generation have been seen as representatives of a parochial and culturally conservative Communist Party establishment which did not engage with the rapid social changes and youth cultures of the 1960s. Certainly Morton's cultural interests and theorising were traditional communist ones. Still, they can be seen as offering an early defence against the attacks on communism as neoliberal capitalism was developing in the second half of the 20th century. Morton's views on aesthetics are clearly articulated in a 1963 essay on Arts and the People, which soon became a pamphlet under the same name. Morton acknowledged that film, TV, and wireless had opened up the possibilities of access to culture. However, the ruling class also seized on these developments to produce unprecedented levels of propaganda. Under capitalism, the arts have become a trivial and nasty industry, with artists increasingly turning away from the world's grim realities and towards introspection, abstraction, and political eccentricity. Morton claimed that the latest stage in the degradation of the arts was the uniformity of art, which benefited American imperialism by destroying national cultural traditions. However, the working class could still develop its own artistic tradition, which would provide the basis for opposition. Some of the more bourgeois English and British cultural heritage, the Dickens, Brontes, and so on, also offered opposition. notably when it refused to accept injustice uncritically, understood human potential, and appreciated the human struggle with the environment. The growth of socialism, grounded in the struggle for a new society, will offer further opportunities for the artist, he argued. Artists will be able to move away from the role of disposable entertainer to help create a new society. This will be in dialogue with the interests of the people rather than artists emphasizing their own genius. As Morton developed his lifelong philosophy of aesthetics, the Western world was moving in a different direction. The era of postmodernity was at hand, and after the 1960s onward, postmodernist thinking was marked by challenges to Marxist meta-narratives and ideas of human progress. The postmodern emphasis would instead be on individualism, kitsch, playful subversiveness, eclecticism, personal identities, and so on. The very phenomena Morton was warning about. Moreover, it now became clear that postmodernity and postmodernism constitute the cultural expression of emerging neoliberal capitalism. These developments, I think, proved fundamental in the challenge to the Communist Party and were part of the fragmentation of the left and far left after 1968 and the rise to prominence of different and often non-Marxist protest movements. Aging communist thinkers like Morton may not have been attuned to the trends in 1960s subcultures, but he and others understood the dangers of what would become known as postmodern cultural turn. And the contradictions were sharpening on the British left. Prominent defenders of postmodernity were to be found in the universities, including among those on the left disconnected from the Communist Party and the Labour movement, and where a provocative youth culture was on their doorstep. The Communist Party was hardly immune either. The Euro-Communist faction effectively represented them, and the fierce debates that ensued helped destroy the Communist Party of Great Britain in the long run. Morton's research on 17th century millenarian and political ideas associated with the ranters and levellers took off in the 1950s, but culminating in the world of the ranters in 1970. Now, Ariel discussed the book in depth and showing how it was related to Morton's present, such as the presentation of the more palatable radicals as proto-communist organisers like Morton himself. I think Ariel's right, and I'll only add something on the ambiguity towards antinomianism in the world of the ranters. Morton's presentation of antinomian figures chimed with the cultural upheavals and student radicalism of the 1960s. But Morton constantly qualified his sympathetic treatment, including notable editorial changes to his earlier essays from the 1950s. The 17th century radicals Morton deemed more admirable were shown to have avoided moving too close to libertarian thinking or the like by his emphasis on their cultured interests, self-discipline, or bureaucratic realism, and occasionally interpretation of the Bible. These provided protection against being too libertarian. Morton, like others among the aging Marxist historical establishment, from Hobsbawm through Hill to Adorno, could not ignore the developments in 1960s radicalism. Equally, they could not fully embrace developments that were often individualistic and hostile to communism traditionally understood. Others, like Morton, responded similarly by producing major works of radical English history that had one eye on the radicalism of the present. See Hill's World Turned Upside Down, Hilton's Bondmen Made Free, published shortly after The World of the Ranters. And there you see the same pattern, protecting that radical tradition protects against excessive libertarianism. Morton was a critic of what he saw as the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 and wrongful interference in another socialist country. Yet Morton remained committed to the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution, unlike influential tendencies on the left and among the influential Euro-Communist faction in the Communist Party of Great Britain. As the destructive inner-party debates over the relevance of historic Marxist categories was taking off, Morton publicly defended notions of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the different forms it could take in different national settings. He made some subtle but undeniable digs at those who were denying this traditional communist analysis. And I think that is quite significant because Morton never spoke out publicly like this. He could be involved in heated internal debates, but him speaking publicly about something was telling, I think. Nevertheless, he increasingly believed that socialist transformation was no longer imminent. As a younger man, Morton believed that the transformation to socialism was at hand. As an older man, Morton increasingly recognised that revolutionary transformation was not coming to fruition in the 20th century. In 1932, for instance, Morton argued that E.M. Forster wrote about the importance of human relationships in a way so ahead of its time that it was effectively for an audience that did not then exist, but will come into being even though it may have to wait for 100 years, and one that will grow up on the far side of the revolution. In other words, the far side of the revolution could be 100 years away, so he's expecting transformation imminently. And the imminence of and speculations about the transformation of history is seen in his poetry from the 1930s. In the early 1950s, Morton and a dying communist establishment were still talking to one another about a socialist transformation at hand. But by the 1970s, it was clear that the revolutionary moment had not happened in England, and Morton argued it was slowing down in socialist countries. And so Morton provided an extension of the timeframes for this transformation, home and abroad. To explain this delay, Morton turned back to William Morris, advocating the argument that before Lenin, Morris developed Marx by outlining a two-stage evolution of socialist society from socialism to communism with an implied transitional period and all the difficulties this entailed in the transformation towards a communist society. Morton argued that Morris knew these transitions might take over a century because they involved the complex transformation of the economy and of human behaviour. This process, Morton observed, of the 20th century was now taking far longer than many, such as himself, once expected. Around this time, Morton became an early advocate of some form of environmental politics and bemoaned the startling growth of car ownership. So God only knows what he'd make of today. Just as when he was a young man, he saw again the potential destruction of the English countryside. Nevertheless, his hope for a new Jerusalem remained. As Eric Hobsbawm put it at Morton's memorial, Leslie Morton stood all his life for building Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land, and I think, when he thought about it, he thought it would look a bit like Suffolk. But also Northern Europe. Morton was a regular visitor to Eastern Europe, especially the GDR, and we have a few accounts from Vivian, including one given to the local Women's Institute, about these trips. Morton was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Rostock in 1975 and maintained these networks in his final years and gave his not inconsiderable library to the university. He was a regular expert on Shakespeare in particular. While still active, his involvement in the party and history groups waned with his health. He died on the 23rd of October 1987 at the Old Chapel while writing his final booklet on the fate of 17th century radicalism and the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688. Now, just to finish, I want to say something on Morton's mixed legacy. The title, People's History of, still carries recognition. The book still carries recognition. Morton's editions of Morris were once relatively standard before later advancements in Morris scholarship. Additionally, he's regularly seen as an influence on utopian studies, perhaps because the field is inherently internationalist in scope and so has some immunity from the prejudices of the traditional British system. In this case, a popular historian and critic not associated with the British universities. Where these prejudices still carry weight, he has often become a mere footnote in a passing, though usually positive mention, or simply ignored in summaries of the history of historians and the influence of the famed British Marxist historians, though there are notable exceptions to this. Yet his role as a leading communist intellectual unquestionably influenced a generation of British Marxist historians who went on to have more famous careers. Morton, I think, should be reinstated at the fore of the story of British Marxist history. The English Utopia and the British Labour Movement were two of the most prominent publications of these heralded years of the Communist Party Historians Group, 1946 to 1956. And if we understand Morton and his leading role among the British Marxist historians, then we also understand the historical materialist nature of their enterprise. This was not just a quaint history from below for its own sake, as sometimes presented. If we're going to single out individual scholarly influence, and that's really quite complicated, I think, in this case, then Morton must be included. Morton's work on the development of the English working class anticipates Thompson's classic, The Making of the English Working Class, while his work on the radical end of the English Revolution in some ways anticipates Hill's classic The World Turned Upside Down. Morton's work on the transformation of the enduring myth of cocaine and English utopianism anticipates Hill's influential essay on the transformation of the myth of the Norman yoke. Morton's work on Morris and Blake predates and anticipates Thompson's. Morton's work on millenarianism anticipates Hobsbawm's. His blurring of history and literature and unapologetic materialist literary criticism predates Hill and Raymond Williams. He has, however, been overlooked as a literary critic in particular, more so than his relative sidelining as a historian. Certainly citations from and references to his publications on individual topics such as Blake or Shakespeare are to be found. But in the canon of British Marxist literary critics, at least, he is not typically mentioned. That Morton was a respected intellectual and literary scholar in the GDR and behind the Iron Curtain, and formally acknowledged as such, partly answers this, of course. But there is more to it. Terry Eagleton's Criticism and Ideology from 1976 was central to the presentation of academic Marxist literary criticism, and Eagleton's scathing and influential reading of the 1930s critics hampered the chances of Morton taking his place in this tradition. Neither vulgar Marxist, and thus easily dismissed by academics, nor overly heterodox, and thus easily praised by them, Morton fits uneasily into the categories and playfully subversive sensibilities of literary criticism, often disconnected from the labour movement, or into an intelligentsia with biases towards the New Left, or Martin Jacques' version of Marxism today. But then again, this probably wouldn't have surprised Morton, and rescuing his academic prestige in British universities may not even have interested him. In a response to the memorial meeting, Vivian noted that Morton's close association with the GDR was not stressed enough. There he was regularly treated as an honoured guest, she said, and in Rostock they claimed him as one of their own. And so I think we should follow the lead of the person who knew Morton best if we want to understand the settings which he, Morton himself, believed his work as an intellectual had most value. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. That was pretty comprehensive. I was very impressed, and there's a lot there that I didn't know about. So thank you very much indeed. And it's raised a lot of, I'm sure that's raised a lot of questions. So I don't know who wants to come in first. Just use the reactions button and the hand up is the best way for me to see you. Otherwise, wave at me. But I haven't got everybody on the screen, and you're not all on video. So who wants to go first? Somebody must want to go first. Right, but I still can't see anybody, so I'm going to ask the question I was going to save till last, which was, I mean, I'm just interested in sort of 2 points you were making. At the end, you were basically seeking to reconcile his approach to sort of the radical tradition to the sort of his contemporary context and his position both within the Communist Party and his attitude to that or development of autocracy within the Soviet Union. If you want to comment on that first, because I think you know, there are, I'm not going to say there's some contradictions there, but there are obviously some difficulties in that relationship. And I wondered if you wanted to comment further.
Yeah, and in many ways, these contradictions are part of the undoing of the party that was happening around him and his place within it. He was, particularly after 1956, but really, I think from 1970s and 1980s, he knew that about these contradictions. He was well aware of them, and he really struggled with them himself. He doesn't write too much about them. I think it's because he wanted to keep some level of discipline. You can get hints from him, but the hints are telling. And you talk to people, and he talked to people from the old history group from the 1980s, and he was pretty distraught about what was happening to the party. He was also he also tried to protect the history group there from some of the fallen time. And two people did say it was his personality and the respect he had that kept it together in some of those difficult times. So I think it was deeply distressing for him, I think, in the last 10 years of his life. how it was playing out in the party. He did. He's quite interesting because after 1956, you do get Stalin doesn't drops out of his references the same way. The Soviet Union is mentioned, but nowhere near as much. He still remains dedicated to the idea of dictatorship of the proletariat, traditionally understood in a Bolshevik sense, but also he thinks that he accepts obviously the Communist Party line that this can be done through a parliamentary transformation and a broad alliance of trade unions and things in this country. But yeah, all these things are happening. They're very important to understand Morton's later life.
Thanks. Right, John Holford.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed that and found it very interesting. And I just add that Leslie was a particularly I remember him well and with affection. Let's put it that way. Although I don't think I knew him particularly well. My question is going to come from a rather different angle. Can you say something about his relationship to workers' education and the workers' educational movement, and in particular in the light of, firstly, the fact that his Vivian's father was Tommy Jackson, who was deeply involved with the Labour College movement, and secondly, something else which I've now forgotten, but which seemed to me to be particularly important. Oh, I know. Yes, I know what it was. I wonder whether you could say something about his relationship with Maurice Dobb, who you mentioned. Maurice Dobb was also somebody who was, despite the Communist Party's dubious rather skepticism about the Labour colleges, remained involved in NCLC events and a teacher for them and so on. I just wonder whether you could say something about his relationship with Maurice Dobb.
Yeah, I'll say the WA stuff at first. I mean, I haven't got too much to say, but he was involved. Him and Vivian were both involved locally. Would regularly give talks. Vivian would do her own talks locally as well. So other to say that they would speak regularly at these events and related events. So they were certainly involved. The relationship with Maurice Dobb starts. He met him at Cambridge in the early 1920s, and when Dobb was just on the ascendancy and would become the first known communist economist in the country. Dobb led a network of socialists, I guess, in Cambridge, and he was the influential dominant figure there. And Morton was influenced by him as much as anyone else and looked up to him and all that. So there is a route through Dobb. Morton's in the Labour Party at this point, the Cambridge Labour Party, but it will only be a couple of years later that he will make the move to the Communist Party. So he remains on good terms with Dobb. The other thing about Dobb, though, is that Christopher Hill's famous comment about the People's History of England, that it should have been revised by Morton rereading Dobb and correcting himself accordingly as he went along. But in the early 1930s, I think Morton was aware that intellectuals faced a difficult time. Dobb was one of them. So was Tommy Jackson. But at this point, I don't think Morton, he had some sympathy, but he wasn't important enough for him to matter, and he just kept in the background at this time. I'm sure there's plenty more that can be said on both, to be honest, but yes, yeah.
Christian Helsberg, you're next.
Great. Yeah, thanks. And thanks, James, for really good talk and for writing the book. You've obviously done so much work on A.L. Morton and digging out his obscure writings and everything. It's really well done. Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because of books on Christopher Hill coming out or out already, aren't there? So it's interesting how some of the figures that haven't had biographies are now getting sort of biographical attention. Yeah, I was going to say, I've got a flippant point and then some maybe slightly more. I mean, you mentioned his Soviet footballers. I just wondered whether you had come across whether he was an Ipswich Town fan at all, because he would have seen Ipswich in some of the good glory periods in the past. But more seriously, I suppose I was reading I came across like letters of T.S. Eliot, and it's interesting because it does show his the kind of friendship or kind of for a period anyway they kind of clearly had or whatever, and sort of their fairly close relationship was quite interesting. And I think in terms of why, I don't know what other people think, but why he stayed with CP, I mean, would it be partly the sense because he was joined quite a lot older than before quite a lot of the other younger sort of members of the communist students group, and in that kind of the third period or whatever, class against class period, I think it would have given him kind of a sense of different sorts of communist activity and so on like that. Why he sort of stayed, and also that period of sort of. But I don't know. The other thing I was going to say is just two other things. I mean, one, like his Get Out pamphlet. I think that was the weakest thing I ever read by Morton. Because it was the anti-Americanism of it, the Little Englandism of it was disappointing slightly. But apart from that, I think, and it's interesting what you said, final thing about Rostock and East Germany, because I think that's where the whole library is, isn't it? University of Rostock or something like that. So, but it's just interesting there, given the AfD in Germany now and stuff, and some sense is sort of anti-fascism is kind of what made him in some ways back in the period, and we're sort of history repeating there again. But okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I've forgotten one of them. I was trying to write them down, so I might have to ask you to repeat what I obviously read your stuff on this, Christian, as well, so thank you for that. The footballer one, he's not really interested in football, he's interested in tennis. And so I was quite surprised to see a football reference, a reassuring football reference. But he played tennis into his 60s, and he played of course gets involved in organising the local club and all that kind of thing, and played. But no, it was and I did one of these things where I found a brilliant reference to a Morton who did well in a race at school, but it turned out to be his brother. So there was a day's work. I made sure I actually footnote because I wasn't wasting it. The Eliot connection was important. Yeah, they did. They remained. It's a working relationship, I would say. Then, and Eliot knew what Morton was like. Morton knew what Eliot was like, but they seemed to work well together. And it's an interesting feature, I think, because in the class against class period, Morton, possibly because his profile's quite low, there doesn't seem to be a problem about Morton functioning in these circles. No one tells him off, and I think it's also a testimony to Morton's personality that he was always able to keep party discipline in settings that were really at odds with what he believed. So whether this is with the weird kind of bohemians, including in London, or whether it was with conservatives like T.S. Eliot and so on, he was still able to do this and didn't seem to see this as a problem. I don't know, just it was part of the nature of him or something. I don't know. There was one of them, I forgot what you said annoyingly, so you might have to remind me. The Get Out one is by far and away the most polemical thing he ever wrote. I still think it's consistent with what he did. I mean, he is scathing towards Americans and American culture, and says that American soldiers are spreading sexually transmitted diseases around Britain and things like this, and so on and so forth. It's very unlike the rest of Morton's stuff. But I think in tone, I think there's still a consistency. It's American imperialism is destroying national traditions and imposing its way on the world. And he was deeply angry, clearly, about the American air bases. And he begins, and he writing it some like, I can hear the planes above and things like that. There was something else there, and I didn't quite get to write it down. I'm sorry, Chris.
It's probably not important. It's just probably other people talk about it. It's just like his being involved in class against class and then staying in the CP.
Oh yeah,
something about Rostock and the AfD.
Yeah, I think you're right about the generation thing. Most of the historians group were slightly younger, and Hobsbawm is the exception, but Hobsbawm's an interesting exception because of his background. His Jewish background comes from Eastern Europe, and he explains why he stayed. Morton doesn't seem to have the anxieties Hobsbawm had on it, and it doesn't look like it was ever in doubt that he would leave. But I think it was because he joined at an early point. He came through the menial work, and the nature of intellectual started to change towards the end of the 1930s. I think it's because he came through the class against class that kept his loyalty to it.
John Atfield.
Sorry, have to hunt for the mic button. James, thank you very much indeed. I think that was a fabulous talk. I must admit, I thought I knew Leslie Morton very well. I was secretary of the CP History Group in the 70s while he was the chairman. He was the chairman the whole of that period. I've learned an awful lot about him that I didn't know, even though I've worked closely with him for many years at that, well, quite a few years at that time. I'd underline pretty much everything said. I think I could never imagine him leaving the party, basically. I think it was just like, you know, the rock that he clung to, even though things were changing and transforming around him. And like you say, you know, with the younger academics and the younger intellectuals and the new left, which was sometimes inside and sometimes outside and sometimes hostile to the party, I do remember, it really stuck in my throat, an exceptionally ungenerous obituary of Leslie Morton by Raphael Samuel, which I still have bad memories of that to this day. But in the history group itself, in the late 70s, it went through a number of transformations. When I became secretary, it was mainly older historians. They spent a lot of their time on local working class histories, people like George Barnsby and so on. And then there was quite a rapid transformation with an influx of new, younger historians who probably I don't think I would even say they were all Euro-communists, but certainly lots of new thinking in different directions, which sometimes became quite controversial within the group, within the party, Althusserians and so on.
Yeah. And
then there was a swing back towards a greater interest in the history of the party itself. You know, the discussions around, you know, updating James Coogan's work and so on. And through all of that period, my recollection is that Leslie Morton kind of let these changes flow over him. And I think the 70s were easier for people like him than the 80s, to be honest.
Yeah.
But in the 70s, my feeling or recollection is that it kind of slowed over him and he was content to remain supportive of whatever we were trying to do. So that's really what I wanted to say. I don't know whether that accords with your feelings. Yeah,
that's very helpful to hear, and it's good to see a face against a name I've seen on several minutes. It's pretty much accords with other anecdotal evidence that I've received on Morton in the 70s and 80s. It's precisely what you say. And it was almost overwhelming, but there was something about his personality, at least, that kept some people on side and things like that. But it didn't. The history group didn't split like other groups, even if the tensions were strong and so on and so forth. So thanks for that. It actually helps me to hear that coming from you, John.
Steve Cushion, you're next.
Yes, I'm rather struck by everything you've said about Morton. There seems to be a nationalism there that seems to be at odds with the kind of Marxist idea of internationalism, if you will. I mean, the anti-US imperialism, you know, was that combined with an anti-British imperialism as well? You know, it's I just sort of see this absolute concentration on England, as it were. There's a sort of nationalism there that doesn't seem to be particularly communist to me, but you might have a view of that.
Well, I could defend Morton on his own terms in this. There was a very, very strong critique of British imperialism. It's notable. I did use the term England deliberately, how he uses it. I use Britain where he uses it, but he would see the importance of homegrown traditions to influence people, to bring people on board, to push for a new future, to help. If you want to get people on board, you want to transform the environment around them and things like this in the home settings. But alongside this, he was emphatic that these traditions exist in other countries and there are connections in national traditions. They just take on different forms in different contexts. So he was a constant visitor to Europe. He was constantly interested in other traditions, even if he didn't write extensively about them. So he would talk about black slave traditions coming from America and things like this. He would talk about American radical traditions as well, where they succeeded, where they failed, and things. Again, not a major emphasis, but it's all there. But he saw his job as a historian in this country to be bringing to the fore things that are relevant to the people around him, farmers and so on and so forth, or workers in industry, their history. So that's why he would say it was crucial. But he was never, I don't think he's ever chauvinist about it at all. On the contrary, and he would work with historians from France and things like this, and they would work together. But his emphasis was on England primarily. So I think he would defend himself, and he would also see himself as an internationalist as well, even if that doesn't come across in the when you take the grand scheme of what Morton did.
Thanks. Can I take Inga Bostrom next, and then Francis afterwards? So Inga.
Hello. That was a great talk. I gave up history at primary school level, and one or two people on this meeting have taken me under their wing over the last 40 or 50 years. But I'm a bit dodgy on some of the jargon. Anti-ammonium. I understand William Blake was.
Oh yeah.
But I don't know what anti-ammonium. I'm sorry to use this as a free history class.
Yeah, sorry.
And also the one that sounds like cats, millenarianism.
Yeah.
Can you just give me a little two-sentence thing? I'll pick it up, I'm sure, but it's just I'm more of an artist than I am a historian.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Antinomianism is from the Greek word about nomos, law. It's about, so that would be someone who is dedicated to the law, to legal interpretation, to behaving themselves. Antinomianism are people who will transcend that, break it, act provocatively, those kinds of things. Millenarianism, well, if you've got another hour, we can have a long discussion. But basically, it's the idea, usually religious, but it doesn't have to be, of the expected transformation of the world into a new golden age sometime in the future, often in the near future is the expectation. So like various religious groups would think, like we would associate them with American religious types these days, but in this country there has been a long history of them as well. Sorry about that. My fault.
Okay. Francis King.
Yeah. Thanks very much, James, for a great talk. I mean, I'm one of those who always quite enjoyed reading Get Out, but it's absolutely vintage Communist Party 1953 sort of stuff, and some of the other stuff the party was producing at that time, including denunciations of the poisonous effect of American comics on the youth and that sort of thing, are really quite something to read. But what I wanted to ask you about was what I would call, possibly a bit cynically, the People's History franchise. Because that's one of the things that Morton, if you like, pioneered with People's History of England, which lots of people with greater or lesser degrees of success have attempted to emulate and take forward. What People's Histories of God knows what now that various people have tried to do. I haven't read that many of them, but I think few of them really match up to the original. But I wonder what your thoughts were on the kind of the subsequent People's Histories that Morton inspired.
Yeah, I think this, in one sense, this is his most famous legacy, isn't it? Is the People's History of. Even if people have never heard of Morton, lots of people have heard of the phrase "a People's History of." I've not read too many of them, but I have looked at them. I think there's a popular misconception that a people's history will often be a romantic look at buccaneering figures from our history and things like this. And nothing wrong with that, of course. Whereas for Morton, it was emphatically a history that understood where we are today in terms of class relations, in terms of technological development and things like this, but it was not focused on kings, queens, battles, etc., etc. It was on those things. So my guess is, and it's only a guess because I would need to go and read a load of these things, is that the people's history has become something of a romantic, popular way of understanding everyday life or radical types in our history. But there is clearly an industry of this, clearly.
Okay, Ariel, you ought to come in.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, James. I thought that was excellent, and I'm glad that we agree on so much. In such a rich talk, it's more, what can I ask you that you haven't said, which is unfair, rather than asking you about something you have said.
That's fine.
One of the things, and we talked about this before, is but I'll come into it this way, is the journalism at the Daily Worker, we haven't really just had the opportunity to discuss, and you haven't really had the chance this evening, obviously, different focuses and all that. And very unfair because I've not yet read your book, so I don't know if you know about it. Do you know about Margot Hyman's correspondence at Goldsmiths concerning the posthumous collection of Morton's works?
Yes.
Yeah, so you'll know in that she discusses Morton, she calls him a great communist and a great historian. And then they work through his pieces in the Daily Worker, and they look at the ways in which what he writes in the Daily Worker is focused by what the party dictates at that particular point. And the great example of that is his changing views of the gunpowder plot.
Yeah.
Depending upon,
yeah.
He writes every time that the party view shifts, he writes a different version of the gunpowder plot, depending upon what, so that they're completely contradictory. And so my question is, and we've discussed this before, is to what extent is he shifting his historical interpretations according to party orthodoxy, whereas people who've left the party after 56 and particularly 57 over internal democracy, while they remain Marxists, Hill is the classic example, have a greater freedom to be able to dissent from party doctrine?
Yeah. I've got a fair bit on the gunpowder plot. His stuff in the 1930s, there's a lot of stuff in the Daily Worker in the 1930s, both historical stuff and what I probably should have mentioned but didn't, was when he took on the role of proprietor of the Daily Worker and nearly went to prison for his headline about a fascist rally, but he got it was deemed not to incite violence in the end. The gunpowder plot, I'd be a bit more generous. I don't know what the word is. I would say it's an updating in light of historical circumstances from Morton's perspective. I think the structure of thought remains the same, but it's still the same argument. I still think it's the party line. He's updating it in line with the party line. But I mean, there are some quite funny moments when those responsible become start off or become Trotskyites. Oh, they must have started off as Trotskyites in the 1930s, and then they become something else by the time you get to the 1950s. So yeah, it's certainly updated in light of those kinds of concerns. And obviously Morton, and I think he would say he would have no problem with the idea that his history is being shaped in line with party interests. Now, we as historians, we can take a different line, and Hill does have that degree of freedom. I think if I was Morton, I think his response would be something like Hill was he wouldn't say he was never unpleasant, he got very well with Hill, but the idea would be, well, your influence, you've got your own constraints in the whole world of bourgeois universities and things like this. That's what's dictating the way you write history. My interests happen to be aligned with the labor movement and therefore more scientific or whatever. I think he would answer, and sort of did answer in those terms. I had to drop the Heinemann stuff in the end for word count reasons, and couldn't go on to what happened after his death too much. But there's still stuff to be done with that, and I'm sure you've been doing a bit with it yourself.
Andrew Foster. Need to unmute.
Thank you very much. Very rich talk. I'm intrigued by this image that's come across as of a shy and difficult to know man, and that's been confirmed by a number of people who've spoken tonight.
Yeah.
What's interesting also from the point of view of Mike Braddock's recent history of Christopher Hill is he has that expression that Hill really was searching around for comments. What do we know about this man? As if they didn't really know him terribly well. But I'm interested the other way around. You've just mentioned that he had a great deal of time and respect for Christopher Hill. Could you say a little bit more about how he did view Christopher Hill and E.P. Thompson? Because I take your point that they are the logical heirs of much of his work.
I'll begin with Morton because I didn't really say much about him. I know Ariel did last time. But it is consistently presented as kind, friendly, willing to engage, mild-tempered, shy, reserved, but everyone seems to really like him. The Secret Service reports do actually come to the same conclusion, but put a negative spin on it, saying he's sullen, he doesn't speak, he's miserable, all these kinds of things. So I think it actually probably confirms it. He knew Hill for quite some time, so I think 1930s onwards. Hill talks about Morton, when they discuss the people's history, about Morton being slightly older and that these young upstarts are all giving their view on this part of history, that part of history. And he said Morton was very tolerant of these people, and so there was the respect that way. Morton, there isn't too much on Morton about Hill, other than they do correspond, and they correspond on historical matters and things like this. Hill writes a memorial for him. He is very, very defensive of Morton's legacy against the Davis book on ranters, and in private as well. I mean, there's not much difference between what Hill wrote in private and what he published about his defense. He was scathing about Davis, whether right or wrong. But Morton, the correspondence is typically, they talk about history and they talk about books they've read and things like that. Thompson, again, likewise, there's bits and pieces, and a wider search might find more. But again, they got on very well. They got, oh yes, as Ariel said, Hill, there was disagreements on Blake and there was disagreements on the Levellers, but again, I think it was friendly disagreement. There was no falling out or anything like that. And I think a similar relationship with the Thompsons as well. As far as I know, that I was told, and that's all I'm going by, the full Thompson archives haven't been opened yet. It won't be for some time, so there'll be plenty more to come out on that in due course. But it seems to be kind of, how do I put it, intellectual, the discussions they had in letters, or organizational, you'll be chairing this, will you come along to that, rather than anything too fancy. But they're always cordial. I mean, there was no, even after 1956, they were good friends and things.
John Atfield, you wanted to come back on point now?
Yeah, just very quickly, subject to party discipline and following the party line and so on. I live in Germany and I'm involved often in discussions and talks about Communist Party history in Germany. And I can say in all honesty that in comparison, certainly in the 1970s, party discipline in Britain was extremely light touch. I remember very, very little, certainly in the history group, anything involving, party discipline or being pushed to follow any party line, either in what people said or what they wrote. That changed again, of course, in the 1980s, because a lot of us in the party were concerned to get rid of the tankies and so on. But that was in the 70s, in my period in the history group, party discipline just didn't figure. That's from my recollection.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. David Parker.
Oh, you need to.
Sorry, did you want to come back on that, James? Sorry.
Oh no, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, I was saying David was unmuted.
Yeah, David.
I've now unmuted myself. Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. I think, like many others who lived through this period, you've told me a lot about A.L. Morton that I didn't know. I only met him on an odd occasion, and I went away thinking what a real English country gentleman he was. That's the sort of impression he made. But I think he probably steered his way through all these difficulties with a great deal of subtlety and tolerance. When they were falling out over Tudor absolutism, and Kiernan and Hill were battling out this argument about whether the Tudor state was a real absolutism or not. You look at the passages in the People's History of England on that, they're absolutely wonderful. And he sort of steers his way through it by saying, well, it was an absolutism by consent, which probably actually conforms to quite a lot of academic thinking. He was very perceptive like that, but that's the impression I had of him. I just want to support what John has just said about the relatively free atmosphere in the historians group, even before 1956, the historians were pretty capable of getting their way. They had no time for Palm Dutt's version of what happened in England in the 16th and 17th century. And Palm Dutt, of course, was a great representative of orthodoxy. In the end, of course, things got exploded with 1956. And I don't think Christopher Hill would actually have left the party had he not been put in an awful position by being on the Commission for Inner Party Democracy. And the relationships between those who remained and those who left remained extraordinarily good. Very different from the situation which developed amongst the Marxist communist historians in France. Some of those who left became so deeply anti-communist. You didn't really see that with the historians group here. There were some who carefully sort of hid. When I was doing my research on that period, and I contacted one or two people, one or two of them didn't want to know. And actually, now hearing what you said about the files on A.L. Morton and there being a spy in the midst, just going back in my mind, wondering whether one or two of the people I spoke to didn't really want to know what were such. But that wouldn't quite square with what they wrote. The last comment I want to make is about Englishness and the preoccupation with England, which is perfectly true. The points you make about Morton there just add that I think in that period, the early period of the historians group, that was true of them all. They came to grief on absolutism, partly because they didn't know much about European absolutism, and they said, oh yes, we must do some work on European absolutism, but they never really got round to it, and they quite consciously said, our job is to renew the history of England and free it from the bourgeois framework in which it's been hitherto developed. They were quite clear about that. So I don't think Morton was particularly unusual with this emphasis on England. So it's just a few observations, really.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I think I also go back to the debate on Tudor absolutism and the absolutism by consent. As you'll know, I think that's where and this is back to Ariel's point, I think this is where we get that comment, isn't there, by where they expect Morton to disagree with Hill, and yet and much to their surprise, he agrees with them, and the debate continues, or something like this. I mean, you'll know that better than I do, I think, David. Oh,
okay, we need to bring this to a close, I think, fairly soon. But Francis King, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, I sort of make a remark about the sort of the pluralist internal regime in the old Communist Party historians group that John will remember. It went back some way. I mean, as early as 1967, the historians group published a pamphlet by Raymond Challoner on Alexander MacDonald and the miners. I think Challoner at that time was a member of the International Socialists. So it's really quite some way from the kind of the stereotype of the party. And I mean, and John will know, I think at the time in 1988, when the Communist Party of Britain split away, a way was found in the historian group of finessing it so that members of who joined the breakaway could nonetheless remain in the historians group. And in fact, I think the secretary of the group at that time was one of the people who joined the breakaway and nonetheless remained in the group. So again, it's very much in line with the sort of politics I think A.L. Morton would have supported, but absolutely not anything like the civil war that took place in certain other bits of the Communist Party at this time.
I was no longer really involved in 1988, but I do remember that when John Foster was basically thrown out of the party, that was pretty devastating for the history group, because he was absolutely a leading member and was very highly respected. So there was that. But that was all in the 80s, not in the 70s.
Can I just
yes,
make
David, yeah.
comment? It's probably something I probably would pursue with you probably out of this meeting, but I was just a little worried about the where you associated postmodernism with Euro-communists in the party. I think there's so many complexities there. I mean, I was always regarded as a Euro-communist, but I never thought about it particularly, and I certainly wouldn't describe myself as a postmodernist. And I think there are lots of cross currents there.
I should be clear here. I was using postmodernism and postmodernity as the cultural condition of late 20th century, early 21st century, and not that someone is a postmodernist, that this is the cultural condition that marks our world, and that this was the condition which the Communist Party found itself in its squabbles, its arguments and debates. Not that individuals were postmodernists, because I think that's a much more difficult and fraught debate that I wouldn't get involved with.
Okay, any last question, quick points from anybody else? I just really wanted to make one sort of final question really from me. Was Morton to something of a rural romantic? I mean, a lot of his writing does come over as focusing on rural issues, and the comment earlier you made that the English utopia might be something like Suffolk. I mean, to what extent was he kind of disengaged from, shall we say, broader, dare I say it, more urbanist contemporary issues, especially in the context of, the normal Marxist line is basically the proletariat is urban based.
Yeah, and he took that line. I think it was as much as anything a personal preference to live in the countryside. He really didn't like living in London at all. He didn't like visiting London in the end. He was just much more comfortable in the countryside, but he was pretty standard on the role of the urban proletariat and things like this. So he romanticized, yes, to some extent, but he was well aware of what was happening, and who wouldn't be a romanticist in that context?
Okay, I just see a hand up from Kelvin Knight. So this is the last point.
Right. Thanks. Yeah, just following on from that, you did say earlier that he wrote about American farmers. I wondered if he wrote anything about the radicalism of Midwestern farmers, early 1930s in particular.
Yeah. Not so much on the farmers. It was a little bit. It was more on. There was a little bit on farming, but it was more on urban workers, I think, and the ways in which their songs and ballads adapted. So he saw it going into different directions. One was this kind of ultra leftist, for want of a better term, radicalism, and the other tradition for Morton was one that was much more grounded in the needs and interests of the emerging American working class. But it's not very much on it, but there is a bit of this stuff in the 30s and early 40s.
Right, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Any final comments, James?
No, thank you. Good to talk. Very good to talk. I enjoyed it.
Well, thanks very much.
Someone else will talk to me about it.
Yeah, I'm sure several people will be reading the book or in touch with you, or trying to extract review copies off the publisher. Can I just say a few things quick things about the Socialist History Society for those of you that aren't members? Do join the Socialist History Society. You not only get notified of our online talks, normally one a month, sometimes more, but also you get 2 copies of the Socialist History Journal a year. Francis, the editor, is waiving the current edition. You also normally get a couple of pamphlets a year and occasionally newsletters from us. So do join. It's important that as many of you as possible join the society, to which you can contribute in terms of telling us what research you're doing, write reviews for us, a whole range of ways in which we want to involve members, and especially younger historians we would like to see perhaps more often than we do at the moment. Can I just also announce there are 3 further meetings fixed. Firstly, we've got on the 19th of May, Kevin Morgan speaking on Aimé Césaire and Martinique. On the 17th of June, we have Philippa Bennett on rewilding William Morris. And on the 16th of September, Martin Shawes will speak on his recent book on the left and CND. And of course, we have the AGM coming up as well, which is on how the Red Army won the Second War on the 3rd of May, which is, as I say, also our AGM, so reports back from our committee and discussions of what the Socialist History Society is up to. So do come to our AGM, which is actually in person, which is nice to see actual people face to face, but otherwise we're generally on Zoom. So thanks very much to all of you for joining us. We had over 70 people listening in and participating today, which is a good number, which is why we do most of these things online now. It gets us a much better attendance. But do come to the AGM on the 3rd of May.
Brilliant.
Okay. Hope to see you all soon, or some of you soon at least.
Thanks very much.
Many thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.